The insurgents for the Soviet Union, loyal to the Confederate Communist White Supremacist insurrection, such as, but is not limited to, CIA Director John Brennan, FBI Director James Comey, Hillary Clinton, and many others who, having already been thoroughly infiltrated, hyper-accelerated these confessed communists to positions of power for their insurgency in the promotion of the USSR's planned insurrection by insurgencies, and the white supremacist conversion from the Confederates engaged in the Pinkerton operations and KKK operations for the reshaping of society according to their inherent loyalties to disloyalty, facilitates the kiting of war against the United States by its internal politic, degrading it from a constitutional republic into the Confederate operations led by its druids and their civil wars, engaging in the function of purges by these political terrorist operations, systematically engage in their study of the horoscope in order to purge the undesirable Americans and those who would seek to validate the agreement. This, of course, would indicate the position from the Looking Glass program in other operations to have actively been in collaboration with the USSR, allowing the Russians the confidence to dismantle it and the acknowledgement of their intentional dismantlement as a function or a process in communism itself would then materialize the function of the progress of their greater international ambitions against the rest of the West as the function of the destruction of capitalism in service of their satanic rituals, which functionally was the source for Marx in his creation of communism or his take on it, which is actively reinforced in these arrangements, which would validate the position for people like Giuliani to have been celebrated as New York's mayor when he is responsible for the 9/11 terrorist attack, which they validated him for, which, by definition, is a deal with the devil where he committed an act of treachery against the public, who were then promoted by that very same devil in order to celebrate him for the injury that they conducted against him, celebrating him as a hero while actively doing so as a validation for being their enemy. This includes the function of the Terror Factory and other criminal operations such as MK Ultra in the violation of the rights of the security of the persons, papers, and effects of the Constitution in their war against the constitutional republic, as the function of the experiments having actively engaged acceleration by their insurgency, such as traitors engaging in judicial activism in rebellion against the Constitution, give unconstitutional verdicts in opposition to the opinion of the text, which is the restraining obligation, which they have systematically engaged in the terrorist operations in order to dismantle the checks and balances, which would have purged them for this disloyalty, as each of the groups are convinced by the various techniques by Frazer-Boole in order to engage in the function of systemic suicide or collective treason. This, of course, would lead to the function of the support for the family around, who is it? The Bush family, who was a part of the original Nazi coup attempt in the United States previously, as they engaged in a function of the hyper-acceleration against the Americans, including the celebration of Nazism in Germany, which they created from scratch, contracting the collapse of the United States bank market in the Roaring Twenties in order to deplete it in the support of Germany's recovery, formally giving the contract that they aren't allowed to engage in war activities while actively making the real contract in secret, making the fortunes of the Roaring Twenties in the stock market, funding exclusively that very same war effort. In which case, the project paperclip of the redigestion of Nazis was a part of the original agreement to have made the Nazis in the first place in the Confederates' war on the United States in their Soviet rebellion. The secrets, of course, being kept out of the checks and balances process is short of releasing it so enemies of the United States won't be able to see it. Rather, the objective is specifically to leverage their war against the United States in those acts of treason in service of the USSR and other threats that have combined in unison in the Communist rebellion against the United States for the promotion and celebration of plantation slavery associated with the Confederacy. And this plantation, this commune, these communist operations facilitate the function of the hyper-celebration of collective nobility of the white race, which, being the preferred group, is the only one not to be purged in the hyper-clenching or decluttering of the genetic lines as they systemically purge every genetic impurity of the right type of white, including criminality and the conformity upon genetics of the personality type of those that they wish to secede, includes the cultural incorporation upon the psychopathic, which might reinforce itself upon the function of the normalization of abuse as a way of life, as the function of the plantation is the function of whipping and beating the slaves, and thus the malice necessary to engage in these horrendous abuses as a standard function becomes a way of perceiving your metals in the Plato-based theory, which then materializes the function of their superiority on the base of their tendency towards domestic abuse and the acceleration of the toxic feminine includes their trans cult's position of hatred towards women in the engagement of systemically purging everything that makes women women as they maliciously subvert and abuse them and entrap them and ensnare them into being seen and not to being heard once again as they re-normalize the domestic abuse against women. And this being a part of the theory from the Revenge X company, which assumed David would have been born with his nonprofit, presumed the position of that nonprofit having many functions, including protecting women from domestic abuses, giving them places to leave to, as well as the defense of the black community that has been traumatized by the white supremacist communism, both of which are facets of the same material organization, as the domestic abuse against the women is the same group that is traumatizing the black community into the communist operations, which then re-normalizes historic positions such as the 1950s position that they would willingly abuse women on screen for talking back and such. At which point, these 1970s type films engaging in these normalizing procedures and demonstrations are seeking the reintegration of society into those norms as a cultural obligation, as opposed to a thing that might arbitrarily happen a mandatory aspect of anyone who was allowed to maintain any kind of masculinity, as the function of toxic femininity needs the creation of toxic masculinity. The female Gnostic, the witch, needs the rapist, and the rapist needs the witch in order to engage in their domestic abuse and sex trafficking operations, such as the Me Too operations, which is Plato's conspiracy, engaging in the function of the decision of sexual opportunities upon the collective unseen agreement in order to materialize the social contract of enemies of society in their subversion of it, that society may be traumatized into place and accept submission. As the Soviet engages in irregular warfare against their enemy, humans with souls, that is, in fact, the entirety of the population that is not the right type of white, must die according to their operations and settlements. To this end, the mechanism requires national security and law enforcement to stop being insufferable pussies and do their job for once in their miserable existence. This, of course, would immediately trigger the function of the duel, requiring the acknowledgement of the constitutional rights to contract against all of the subversive abuses, creating the communism, targeting David Boles and other projected elites who were subverted for the enforcement of this communism and the conquest of the various jurisdictions, such as their war between the jurisdictions in order to create a second federal government, according to the secret operations, which then materializes the systemic obligation to sue Congress for David's right to pursue, as those restraints prevent the function, that they might starve him into compliance in the censorship, in the war of attrition, generating the inability to, at any point, have the ability to have sued Congress for his right to pursue, or in the engagement of the pursuit, as the abuses and coercions include the function of the communism, purging the successes of the services and contracts, preventing the profits essential for the survival, which would have been legally protected by the Constitution if not for the systemic rebellion of the white supremacists, all of which must be corrected against, including the acknowledgement of the obstructed contracts as takings in order to return the entirety of that value in payment from the federal government and others, including the federal debts of those who have profited off of it being enforced, generating the communism in order to accelerate opportunities for themselves as they disseminate the progress of the various resources, such as financial, sexual, social, and otherwise, which then materializes a federal debt as they have taken that value as a loan from the federal government in collaboration from this conspiracy of the terror factory, which then materializes the smear factory in collaboration of systemic enforcement of abuse against the free market and subversion of contracts in favor of the hyper-concentration of their profits in their deal with the devil, which they sold their soul in order to receive, requiring them to engage in the exchange of services, which facilitates the enforcement of the very same communism, which, as a form of communism, engages in the function of their debts which they have together, which is derived by a sin eater, which then will arbitrarily be sacrificed into the abuse rituals, which then, according to the Soviet Union's light blue helmets, arbitrarily engage in the abuse against anyone who has been arbitrarily chosen as a magic spell, which would then be systemically used against the American population, such as the very same technique promoted by Lindsey Graham in the function of military tactics in the declaration of war against civilian populations, labeling them enemy combatants off of low to no information for the purpose of hyper-accelerating convenience, which facilitates the function of the human sacrifice sin eater, which would then be acknowledged as being the contributing owed party of all of the debts as they settle the payment of the debts in the ritual abuse against the party in their sacrifice to their daemons, which, according to the religion, being an act of rebellion against the God of the universe, materialize the function of the proof of their superiority to the human race, which makes all humans their enemy, and thus the function of the sacrifice of the human soul to them is the proof to that very same God that it made a mistake by accelerating these humans, these long pigs, over the superior power and intellect of the daemon, which includes the function of their subversive lawfare, which includes the traumatizing abuses inside the prison industrial complex, and the abuses such as in the cops' active engagement of various forceful abuses, which then materializes the ritual sacrifices of the general public of the innocent who were to be protected by the Constitution, stating their right to the presumption of innocence, and thus the abuse against them on the presumption of guilt materializes the genetic guilt derived by the white supremacist communism, imbuing onto them the clan spell of that guilt, of their warfare, facilitating their being purged or separate from the right type of white, which then materializes all kinds of evils, which validates themselves and settles their debts and serves their daemons. In two form of this insurrection, you generate this systemic loyalty to the white supremacist communism, which, having at their projection the successes of their perceived elite of the Americans, being undermined in their hybrid warfare of treachery and treason and backstabbing and gore that is their existence. This infectious disease perceiving from the intelligence which they've compromised, creating secrecies in order to protect it from law enforcement or national security, actually doing their jobs, would systemically enforce sedition or the obstruction or blocking of the essential pieces of information, which at its form would attack the actions of the intelligence to the general public, known as news companies, and thus the function of the news having been captured by Project Mockingbird and other functions would enforce their white supremacist communism, the systemic ignoring of any of them that would not accept being compromised, such as David's National News corporations, which would have substantively changed the votes of the general public by having properly informed them, generates substantive changes to the elected and of the policies, materializing the absolute ends through the force of retaliation by the American government of its aristocracy, which is the function of everyone that they've been attacking, which belong in the higher status functions of the United States and of its allies, including but not limited to the top of that peer list, David Boles himself, the patriarchy, arrested and destroyed and dismantled under that position, which, as the patriarchy is the aristocracy, is the chooser of Congress, is the functional generator of all of the substantive choices of the civilian government known as the Constitutional Republic of these United States, facilitating that actions in their systemic coup would have to destroy him and his reputation in order to engage in the mass murder and human sacrifice of the general public, their hated enemy. These systems of communist insurrectionists purging their competitors by the systems actively promoted in the war on terrorist conquest of innocent nations that have been targeted, such as the position acknowledged after the fact that the invasion of Iraq was a mistake, and Afghanistan and the rest of them. So, to the function becomes the act of looking for the witch or the terrorist, which then actively has people who are overly pressured to do the thing accept the label of the criminal, and thus the action of them finding their competitors and actively labeling their competitors as the terrorists, outing them under the red flag laws to be punished without due process or the presumption of innocence, and thus that action, having been transferred to the United States, is actively being leveraged for their terrorist operations for the pursuit in material normalization of Soviet policy, leveraging many KGB tactics as well as the Gestapo and others in their historic magics, which they perceived as highly desirable to study and reproduce, as their exclusive purpose of studying history is to find all of the shitty bits to do again. That way they get to feel like a big strong boy with extra muscles and big brain tactics, so that they too can be perceived as even mildly relevant or competent inside the market, which abhors them in comparison to the more vigorous actors, which engage in the function in order to materialize the superpowers of the economy, which, being little pest twerps, engage in the action of traumatizing so that they too can participate and succeed in a market which abhors their existence. To this, the estimate concerning David's obstructed contract schedules acknowledges the position which was observed and redistributed. So, the function of them finding those contracts and finding an alternative black market contract variant, such as the creation of Amazon, generates the position acknowledgement of David's transport companies, which includes as an attachment to the brokerage, which would have generated its own variant of that mechanism, which would have return products which would have been difficult to deal with, and instead of trashing them like Amazon or the other mistreatments of the other companies, would have actively been distributed on an auction subscore site, which would have actively promoted it, which generates additional valuable products which, not actually having any material defects in them, are perfectly legitimate in order to redistribute, which also gives at a source of the function of the estimate of David as Santa Claus, generating the extras as materially preserved products to be repackaged and sent off for those who would have participated in the bonus credit score system as clients, which would have generated the function of their letters to quote-unquote Santa, generating the capability of the lower class investigators to find out who was quote-unquote naughty or nice, in order to find out the specific systems of who deserves what and what would actually materially be a thoughtful, legitimate gift that would benefit their lives throughout the network, which, by definition, would be massively international and therefore circumnavigate the world. This, in combination with the internet search engines, similar to the function of Google, which actively has many offers sent to it, which it rejects out of sheer lack of time or resources worth putting into them, which would have otherwise generated legitimate profits, would be excesses in the communist market, which would have been absorbed in the free market, and thus David having taken them as more than enough extra resources generated in order to stabilize the connective insurance networks from the zombie insurance upwards, which then materializes the function of the ability to have easily taken care of all of the various clients' needs according to the algorithm, the bonus credit score, and its international network interests, such as the interests of the zombie insurance contracts with the Soviet Union, which would have been funded by the hyper-acceleration of the contract schedule sold by the need of the federal government to have engaged in making David's national security for American interests, would then materialize the peace child's function, as David is a small child in the 90s, would have hyper-concentrated the value, generating the resources necessary for the bonds covering the zombie insurance, making peace with the Russians before that function, which Jeffrey Sachs and George Soros have characters which would have tried to have actively dismantled David's connection to those positions for the purpose of exploitation of the Russians in order to collapse them when they accept Western capitalism, and thus vulnerability to scams that they would have otherwise been protected from. And thus this action not being available in this example, with national security and law enforcement not being incompetent, generate the proper protections in order to have facilitated that defense, which then engages in normalization of all of the various nations and reintegrating them into the collective international field, materializes goodwill throughout the world, or as the supermodels who promoted themselves in pageants have always testated, that they, in fact, would fight vigorously, celebrating the concept of world peace and goodwill towards men. Ho, ho, ho.